90 hoje em dia, nada.
1,5 liraya bisküvi.
Ich denke, ein Kaffee aus dem Automat bestimmt.
Did you know it costs 50 cents to feed one hungry child for one full day?
50 cents to feed one child a day.
Mümkün mü?
Increíble.
아유, 그러면은 당장 그걸 사야죠.
With the Share the Meal app, you can share your meal with children in need with just 50 cents and a tap on your smartphone. Smartphone users outnumber hungry children by 20 to 1. Imagine the impact you and your friends can have. Together, we can end global hunger. Please download the app.
This is DW News coming to you live from Berlin. Putin claims victory in the besieged city of Mariupol and again calls on Ukrainian fighters there to surrender. The Russian president holds off on plans to storm the city's Azovstal steel plant, instructing his forces to blockade it instead with Ukrainian troops and civilians inside. Also coming up, Ukraine exhumes its dead from mass graves, gathering evidence of possible war crimes as
son properly.
Well, with calls growing for Germany to act faster to arm Ukraine to fight Russian forces, the government here in Berlin is reportedly preparing an arms swap with fellow EU and NATO member Slovenia. Under the deal, Slovenian forces would send a large number of tanks to Ukraine. To replace these, Germany would then provide Slovenia with tanks from its own supplies. Stay with me. Germany is already supplying large amounts of weaponry and ammunition directly to the Ukrainian army, but it has not delivered tanks or warplanes. Let's cross over to DW political correspondent Simon Young. Simon, this sounds like a very convoluted way of going about things.
Yeah, Leila, these are unconfirmed reports so far, but Berlin has been making it clear for some time that it thinks that if other countries could send their Soviet-era equipment to the Ukrainian military, then they could step in and replace that equipment. So in order to, as it were, maintain NATO country defences. And if a country like Slovenia is able to send tanks, then that would be one such deal. According to Slovenian media, that country has 46 T-72 tanks, the old Soviet manufactured tanks. Actually, they're referred to as M84 because that's a special Yugoslav army variant of this tank. But the good thing about it is those tanks could be sent immediately, and they could also be put into service immediately by the Ukrainians. No training required because they already are familiar with the T-72 tank. So, you know, they could start using it right away. And that, of course, could be key because all the observers say that the next few weeks is very likely to be decisive in this battle for the east of Ukraine in particular.
Just to clarify, why isn't Germany delivering tanks directly to Ukraine?
Well, the German government says that it just doesn't have that kind of equipment that it can send. It says that all the equipment that it does have, it needs for its own defence and defence commitments. It, of course, does have commitments within NATO. And that, too, is a key part of Germany's defence posture. So it says that we don't have at least not significant amounts of heavy material that could be sent. And the further problem, as I suggest, that what could be sent would require significant training. And they also say you have to send whole weapon systems, that's to say not just tanks, but also armoured personnel carriers and other types of weapons along with it. Otherwise, it just doesn't make sense to, as it were, send a few tanks that happen to be lying around. In any case, Germany says it just doesn't have that material available.
As you know, Simon, there's a lot of pressure on Germany to end imports of oil and gas from Russia. But I understand that that won't be happening.
Well, there is an effort ongoing. All the government ministers have been speaking in recent days, say they're doing what they can to reduce reliance on Russian energy sources. And for instance, if we look at oil, they've brought that down from about a third to just 25% of Germany's imports have come from Russian oil this year. But it's still, there is a huge dependency, German industry in particular, very reliant on having stable energy sources. It comes from Russia. The pipelines are set up to receive it from Russia, and changing that will take time. That's what they're saying. They're working hard at it. Annalena Baerbock says we're reducing our reliance every day, and they hope to end reliance on Russian oil, for instance, by the end of this year.
DW political correspondent Simon Young, thank you. Let's tell you about the other stories making news around the world. At least 10 people are dead and dozens more wounded from an explosion at a mosque in Afghanistan. The blast targeted Shia worshippers in the northern Afghan city of Mazar-e-Sharif. The so-called Islamic State group has claimed responsibility for the attack. Authorities in Shanghai say the city will remain under tight COVID-19 lockdown. That's despite some districts reporting no new infections. Millions of people are barred from leaving their homes in an attempt to contain the outbreak. The strict measures are part of China's zero-COVID policy. The United Kingdom's Queen Elizabeth has turned 96 years old. Palace officials released a photograph to mark the occasion, showing the monarch posing with two of her favorite ponies. The Queen was also treated to a rendition of Happy Birthday by the guards of Windsor Castle. Over 5 million people have now fled Ukraine since the start of the Russian invasion 2 months ago. But for many who remain in the country, a new normal has emerged. For one comedian, getting back to work means finding a safe venue for his audience after theaters were forced to close, and to provide some laughter amongst the tragedy.
Making people laugh might be an unusual job in times of war, but for Felix Redcar, he's determined to see the funny side. During the first week of the war, my fellow comedians and I were in shock. There was nothing we could do but scroll through the news every day. Then the initial shock passed and I started thinking about how I could be useful. And we decided that, like before the war, we could be useful by doing stand-up concerts. After Russian troops besieged his hometown of Sumy, he decided to take his talents to a Soviet-era bomb shelter. The first bunker show drew 100 people. Felix said they were desperate to leave home and to laugh. It wasn't difficult for us comedians to perform because the audience were open to it. Before that, the people had to stay home for weeks, and every day was like Groundhog Day. While he waits for the war to end and for venues to reopen, he's using social media to spread laughter and offer some relief in the darkest of times.
You're watching DW News. Here is a reminder of our top story. The U.S. will send more military aid to Ukraine. The Biden administration says it will give hundreds of millions of dollars of heavy artillery and drones to Ukraine, in addition to the equipment it has already supplied. Russian President Vladimir Putin has claimed victory in the besieged city of Mariupol. The U.S. administration says, however, there is no evidence that Russian forces completely control the city. A small force of Ukrainian soldiers is still holding out at the Azovstal steel plant. You're watching DW News live from Berlin. Up next is News Asia with Paresh Banerjee. And we'll have the world headlines for you again at the top of the hour. Hope to see you then.
Is the end of the pandemic in sight? We show what it could look like. A return to a new normal. And we visit those who are finding it difficult. Experiences, successes, and news. In our weekly COVID-19 special. COVID-19 special. In 60 minutes on DW.
Hello guys, this is the 77%, the platform for Africa's youth to debate issues and share ideas.
You know, on this channel, we are not afraid to touch on delicate topics.
Africa's population is growing fast. And young people clearly have the solutions.
The future belongs to you.
The 77%, every weekend on DW.
It started out with spooky intimidation and transformed into an orgy of hate and violence. The history of the Ku Klux Klan, the oldest terrorist organization in the United States. Its members fight for a racist state ruled by white supremacy.
What we're talking about here is not only disorganized violence, it's not only terrorism, it's politics.
Founded over 150 years ago, it's repeatedly died out, but always been resurrected. The Ku Klux Klan starts May 11th on DW.
This is DW News Asia. Coming up today, Hong Kong loosens COVID restrictions after 4 months. Theme parks are among some of the places Hong Kong residents can visit again. The pursuit of zero COVID cases had led to stringent restrictions across the city. So how are residents reacting? Our correspondent reports. An easing of some restrictions too in Shanghai, another Chinese city bearing the brunt of the zero COVID strategy. But is the government determined to stay the course? And later in the program, fortune telling for the digital age. How traditional Thai astrology is reaching hundreds of thousands of young people through apps. I'm Paresh Banerjee. Welcome to DW News Asia. Glad you could join us. For the first time in 4 months, residents of Hong Kong have something to look forward to in their COVID-plagued city. Gyms, beauty parlors, theme parks and cinemas have reopened. People can dine in restaurants till 10 p.m., 4 hours longer than the earlier 6 p.m. cutoff. Some schools have also resumed in-person teaching. It's part of a relaxation of COVID restrictions that have been one of the toughest anywhere in the world. It's been prompted by a fall in daily COVID cases to below 1,000 from a high of more than 70,000 in March. And in the middle of it all has been DW correspondent Phoebe Kong, who joins me now from Hong Kong. Phoebe, going to cinemas or visiting a beauty parlor, things that Hong Kong residents haven't been able to do for about 4 months now. Talk to us a bit about how people are reacting today.
Well, definitely we can feel a sense of excitement and relief on the ground in Hong Kong here today, as various venues are allowed to reopen, including recreational, sports and entertainment facilities like cinemas and so on. And restaurants can resume dining services for dinner's hours, that the number of people per table can be raised from 2 to 4 right now. It's really hard to get a seat for dinner in Hong Kong for any popular or even just average restaurants. As my friends and I try to make a reservation, but many of the restaurants have been fully booked for the coming weeks or even months. So you can feel the sense of popularity and how people are excited to go out and dine out again and gather with their friends. And we also seen pictures of parents who can't wait to bring their children to theme parks like Disneyland, even though today is a working day. So although there are still some certain kind of limits, this kind of venues are still subject to limits on capacity and vaccine pass policy. Mask is still compulsory everywhere in Hong Kong. But still, from what we've seen today, these kind of constraints is not stopping people from going out or even to have some fresh air.
However, these COVID restrictions have been in pursuit essentially of Beijing's zero-COVID strategy, which aims to isolate people to break off infection chains. I wonder what the cost of all of this has been to Hong Kong.
Well, the fifth wave of COVID infections is not only deadly for the human lives in Hong Kong, but also people's livelihoods, especially the businesses. And no matter it's more big businesses are all hard hit during the latest wave of infections. That according to the official data just released today, that the unemployment rate has surged to 5%, which is the highest figures in 9 months, and it's also affecting public services. For example, today we've seen people lining up long queues are seen outside government department for people are rushing to renew their driving license. That's because such public services have been heavily interrupted through the past few months. So Hong Kong has become largely unfunctional during the fifth wave of infection, and essentially because of the zero COVID policy that has put the city in a standstill. And it's also scaring off foreign talents that we have seen the most severe brain drain of foreign talents during the fifth wave of infection, that lots of expatriates have left the city because of the border closure and the very stringent draconian measures. That such damage has been done, and people fear that could be permanent.
So given what you're saying, what is the government's plan moving forward?
Well, the government is still remaining pretty cautious about the feature of and also the situation of the infection. Although today many measures have been relaxed, but basically we're just getting back to the status before the fifth wave of infections. It is still one of the most stringent imposed city around the world. That and essentially many people are concerning that the government is not laying out a roadmap for them to see, there's still no end in sight, to end the zero COVID policy, and as long as Beijing is sticking with it, it's not very likely that Hong Kong can make a detour.
Phoebe Kong, we'll leave it there for the time being, but thank you so much for talking to us today. And as Phoebe was just saying, Hong Kong's zero COVID policy hasn't just taken a toll on human beings, it's also having a huge impact on the environment. Here's why.
From the moment you step off the plane in Hong Kong, there's people wearing plastic everywhere you look. And once you've collected your luggage and are taken to a quarantine hotel, there's even more plastic.
All the kind of surfaces that typically you would touch with your hands, like the phones, the remote controllers, everything's been cellophane wrapped. Every single one of the staff members here wears full PPE, you know, the gowns, the gloves, the booties, the hats, and that's every staff member on every floor.
The toiletries provided by the hotel come double wrapped in plastic, and the food is also no exception.
The meals arrive 3 times a day, so morning, lunch, dinner, and they are all provided in a plastic bag.
Which begs the question, what to do with all that extra plastic waste generated by the pandemic? Much of it ends up in one of 3 municipal landfills. Although Hong Kong is one of the world's richest cities and one without much space, little of its waste is recycled.
The plastic overall recycling rate for plastic scrap is about 11% only. So it's a small percentage. And so the rest, nearly 90% of the plastic waste is either end up in our landfills or end up in the glacier.
Environmental activists say the government's quarantine policies make the city's waste problem even worse, and that more items should be reused or recycled.
People living in the quarantine hotels, they are not confirmed cases. So what they have used, just like any normal persons, they're clean.
As if the plastic waste weren't enough, Hong Kong is also rushing to build temporary isolation centers on waterfront property. Critics say the units have no long-term use and will eventually also wind up as garbage.
So that's Hong Kong, but what is happening on the Chinese mainland? As we've been reporting, the situation in Shanghai has been especially difficult, with as many as 25 million people confined to their homes since the start of April. We're starting to see some easing there, with residents in certain districts allowed out. But for now, most curbs appear set to remain in place as infections outside of quarantined areas rise again. Correspondent Fabian Kretschmer, who's based in Beijing, has more on how authorities are handling the crisis.
There are new hopes that the ongoing lockdown in Shanghai might slowly come to an end. For the first time, 2 districts have announced that there are no new daily symptomatic cases. That means that several million residents by now are at least able to go outside and walk on the street. However, the city is still far from being normal. Most residents are still locked inside their apartments, and even if you're allowed to go outside, there's really not much what you can do with most facilities being shut down. And for some residents, the suffering continues. On social media, there are new shocking videos posted every day. For example, about an elderly woman. She's over 90 years old, and because she tested positive but didn't show any symptoms, still health workers forced their way into her apartment and dragged her against her will into an isolation center outside of the city. It's clear that the Chinese leadership will stick to their zero-COVID approach. State leader Xi Jinping has recently announced that more hard effort is needed to fight the pandemic. What that means is quite clear. Even if the outbreak in Shanghai can be brought under control, it means that it's only a matter of time until the next lockdown will be imposed. For the economy, there will be ongoing downward pressure, and also the already huge isolation of the country will further deepen. According to estimates by the European Chamber of Commerce, half of the European residents here in China have left the country since the pandemic began. And it's estimated that over the course of the summer, among the remaining people, another half will also move out.
To Thailand next, which has a long tradition of astrology. Astrologers predict the future, provide advice and guidance to those who want it. And now, in keeping with changing times, it has gone online and digital.
Shuffling the cards before revealing what they say about the future. Astrology has long been a part of Thai culture, and now fortune-telling has gone online. A new app with nearly 500,000 users is geared to the younger generation. One student who says he didn't previously believe in the supernatural now follows fortune tellers' advice.
I need some help with my education. So I set this wallpaper on my phone so that everything that I expect will go smoothly.
Fortune tellers say they've noticed a change in customers' priorities over the past couple years.
There are more people looking for career advice now. Before the pandemic, it was mostly about love and relationships. But since the pandemic, I've had twice as many questions about careers.
Psychologists acknowledge that stress levels are high and people need someone to listen, but caution against relying on fortune tellers.
Having someone help relieve your anxiety is only mental first aid. It could jeopardize your ability to make decisions for yourself in the long term.
The app's manager says young people already know how to get the answers they need from the internet, and that fortune telling is one way of trying to find peace of mind when it comes to life's uncertainties.
And that's it for today. There's more on our website and on Facebook and Twitter. We're back again tomorrow at the same time. We'll see you then. Goodbye.
So you want to know what makes the Germans tick? News just in. The Germans love beer and banning things.
Step away from the sponge.
What? I'm not even allowed to wash my own car.
No.
And everyone wears lederhosen every single day. Just kidding. Are you ready to meet the Germans? Then join me, Rachel Stewart, on DW.
What's making the headlines and what's behind them?
DW News Africa.
The show that tackles the issues shaping the continent.
Life is slowly getting back to normal here.
We're on the streets to give you in-depth reports and insights.
Our correspondents on the ground reporting from across the continent.
All the trends that matter to you.
DW News Africa, every Friday on DW.
The world's biggest food companies raise prices and warn of more hikes ahead for consumers. We'll take a look at how the food crisis is hitting the world's poor. And 9 years after the collapse of a Bangladeshi garment factory shone a spotlight on the industry's poor conditions, we'll look at whether anything has changed in the country. And Italy does a deal with Angola as it seeks new natural gas suppliers in its quest to ditch Russian energy. Chelsea Delaney, welcome to the program. Major global food and beverage companies are increasing their prices amid surging commodity and energy costs. Swiss food giant Nestle said it boosted prices 5.2% in the first 3 months of this year. The company warned that further price increases will be necessary throughout the year. Danone has also warned of further price increases. Russia's war in Ukraine has exacerbated inflation by cutting off key exports of grains and oil from the region. It's the latest sign that inflation, which is hitting record highs in several countries, will continue to affect consumers in the months ahead. Now, skyrocketing prices are hitting the world's poor. The president of the World Bank has warned that the world could face a, quote, human catastrophe as people struggle to afford enough to eat.
In the heart of Buenos Aires, crowds are lining up at this soup kitchen. Some are regulars here, others are first-timers, driven by an economic crisis with sky-high inflation of 50%. The government has been paying a one-time grant of around $160 to the poorest, but it doesn't go far enough. Hopefully we'll be able to make the most of the grant. Mostly we'll use it for food. When the government provides aid, we always stock up on food that doesn't expire quickly, so that we have something for the future. What can you get with this grant? 3 boxes of milk, and those with newborns, 2 packs of diapers. Obviously it helps, but it's not enough. IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva said the war and the pandemic are a massive setback for the global economy. She insisted G20 countries must continue to cooperate to deal with pressing problems.
Accelerated inflation. It has become a clear and present danger for many countries, rising food and fuel prices are straining the budgets of ordinary families to a breaking point.
Meanwhile, the World Bank, working closely with the IMF, is forecasting a prolonged crisis.
One of the key transmission mechanisms is the shortages of food, of energy, and of fertilizer. The fertilizer and energy are critical for the crop cycle, so they're building on each other and creating a food insecurity crisis that will last at least months and probably into next year.
Finance officials from the US, Britain and Canada walked out over Russia's participation in a G20 meeting to address the headwinds confronting global growth. Resolving the food and energy crisis remains a major challenge as long as the war continues.
Now, it's been 9 years since the Rana Plaza textile factory collapsed in Bangladesh, leaving over 1,000 people dead and many more injured. The accident exposed the dangerous working conditions for Bangladeshi garment workers to the rest of the world. Our next report looks at what has and hasn't changed for garment industry workers in the years since the disaster.
Just outside the Bangladeshi capital Dhaka stands one of the newest and most modern textile factories in the country. It's run by the Beximco company. Here, 40,000 employees make jeans for major brands, supplying the US and European markets. Everything here is cutting edge. The factory has been built from the ground up after the company had outgrown the old building. A disaster like Rana Plaza, unthinkable here.
Rana Plaza was one horrible memory which sort of happened. Did Bangladesh learn from that and change? The answer is yes. The Bangladeshi factories who, from the point of view of civil safety, electrical safety, fire safety, are the safest in the world.
Worker protection laws also improved in Bangladesh after Rana Plaza, although worker rights are still an issue in many places. Not at Beximco, a popular employer. Our working conditions have developed a lot now, compared with the situation a few years back. With my current salary, I am living a very decent life. But things are different in many other factories. Despite Bangladesh adopting international laws meant to improve working conditions. The problem, some of these laws leave loopholes that are often abused according to union leaders. There is a termination law in our labour law. According to this law, the employer can terminate any worker at any moment without cause, even if the factory is profitable and has sufficient work orders in hand. Bangladesh is the world's third largest textile producer, but low wages are a big factor behind that. Business will continue to be strong, and while workers are better protected than they once were, there is still plenty of room for improvement.
Hanan Majid is a documentary filmmaker at Rainbow Collective in London. He joins me now. Hanan, you've spent years interviewing workers in Bangladesh garment factories for your documentaries. From your perspective, what has changed since Rana Plaza?
Chelsea, thank you for having me. First, one of the things that has changed we've seen the Fire and Building Safety Accord, which was signed by 190 brands and 1,600 factories, and I think it's around 9 unions have joined it as well. So that means you've got a group going into factories and they're able to check for fire and building safety, which is a positive thing. But one of the things that hasn't changed is the condition of the workers, I think. And I think we've seen slight improvements. We've seen a bit of improvement in the minimum wage, which at the moment, the last time I checked, was $94, which is still really low for the amount of hours that they're working. And so I think that's one of the biggest issues for me, is that the level of exploitation that's happening in countries like Bangladesh is still quite high. And because they're paid so low, they're still having to go into work even when the conditions of the factories aren't great. And it was great to hear one of the factories that was in this report. But you have to remember, not all factories are like that. Especially when you're going to the more rural areas, they're not going to be as equipped as those factories, And I've been covering the garment workers, their fight for, their fight for fair wages and their fight for better conditions since 2010, and now I'm still hearing the same stories. We're currently doing a documentary with workers from Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, and the stories are still the same. Being forced to go into work when you don't want to go in, being forced to do extra hours when you don't want to do the extra hours, getting into trouble for taking time off. The only positive thing that I've seen post Rana Plaza is that we're seeing more workers being unionized than ever before. So when I was doing these documentaries in 2010, you weren't getting as many workers getting unionized because there was a fear to getting unionized, because what would happen was the factories would threaten you and things like this. But yeah, that's just some of the things that I think.
So that's, the conditions still seem to be quite bad for a lot of workers there. This is a system that obviously benefits Western brands enormously. What have they done to improve conditions for workers? Just briefly, if you can.
Well, I think first, they signed up to the accord, and I think, that's them giving themselves a pat on the back. But I think, personally, the Western brands, what they need to really do is check how these factories are operating on a regular basis. They need to be going to the factories, do spot checks, and see and talk to workers and really find out what's going on over there. Because at the moment, it's kind of like just, they're giving these orders from a distance, but they're not really seeing what's happening over there. And so, and the other thing is that they're not really paying what they need to be paying so that everyone is getting a fair wage. When you go to any of these stores like Prime or anywhere like these, they have these big billboards up saying that they're doing things like this. But when you talk to people on the ground, it doesn't seem that way.
Still a lot to do. Hanan Majid, a documentary filmmaker in London, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Now to some of the other global business stories making news. Tesla has reported strong earnings for the first quarter of 2022, beating expectations by around $1 billion. It's largely thanks to sales of U.S. regulatory credits the company gets for making electric vehicles. However, analysts said the Shanghai lockdown, which closed Tesla's plant there, could hit the carmaker's second quarter earnings. More than half of Brazilians have cut their consumption due to high inflation. A new study of the Brazilian Confederation of Industries published this week shows that 15% of the population have cut their consumption of gasoline completely, and 31% are eating less meat. Brazil registered its highest inflation rate in 28 years in March. German exports to Russia have collapsed since the start of the war in Ukraine. In March, they fell by 58% year-on-year, or around 1 billion euros. The plunge means that in the space of a month, Russia has fallen from 5th to 12th in the list of Germany's biggest export destinations. Now, Italy has struck a deal with Angola to increase natural gas imports. Rome is rushing to find new suppliers to replace Russian gas, which currently makes up about 40% of its supply. The country hopes to be independent of Russian energy within 18 months.
This is a big deal for both Angola and Italy. The EU's third biggest economy wants to replace Russian gas, which accounts for 45% of its supply. The Angolan foreign minister called it a strategic partnership. His Italian counterpart says it's a win for both countries and stressed their cooperation on other vital issues. We also dealt with major international affairs issues, in particular the effects of Russian aggression on Africa's food security, which is severely compromised, especially in relation to wheat supplies. The conflict affects everyone, and no one is excluded. This trip, however, is really about getting Italy independent of Russian gas. Last week, Rome struck agreements with Algeria and Egypt, and now Italian officials are headed to the Republic of Congo as they increasingly pin their hopes on Africa becoming a major energy partner.
And a reminder of the top business story we're following for you this hour. The world's biggest food companies are raising prices amid surging commodity and energy costs. Russia's war in Ukraine has exacerbated inflation by cutting off key exports of grains and oil. And that's our show. Thanks for watching. See you next time.
Is the end of the pandemic in sight? We show what it could look like. A return to a new normal. And we visit those who are finding it difficult. Experiences, successes, and news. In our weekly COVID-19 special. COVID-19 special. In 30 minutes on DW.
The magic of the mountains. On the Glacier Express through the Alps. A once-in-a-lifetime dream journey. It attracts people from all over the world. What is this tour all about? Through mountains and valleys on the legendary train, the Glacier Express.
In 75 minutes.